The mud of the St. Lawrence Valley does not forgive, and on the morning of November the 11th, 1813, it seemed intent on swallowing the British Empire whole. There is a specific kind of silence that falls over a battlefield before the first musket cracks a heavy, suffocating quiet, where a man can hear nothing but the rush of his own blood and the rattling of frozen branches in the wind. Standing on the slight rise of a muddy field belonging to a farmer named John Crysler, Lieutenant Colonel Joseph Wanton Morrison looked out into the grey mist and saw his own death marching toward him. It was not a skirmish line he beheld, nor a raiding party. It was a deluge. Before him, emerging from the gloom like a slow-moving tide of blue and grey, were 4,000 American soldiers. They were supported by cavalry, artillery, and the sheer overwhelming confidence of an army that knows it possesses a 5-to-1 numerical advantage. Morrison looked back at his own line. He had roughly 800 men, a patchwork force of British regulars from the 49th and 89th Regiments, shivering in their greatcoats, flanked by a handful of Canadian militia and Mohawk warriors. By every metric of war, by every calculation of logistics and probability, the battle was already lost before the first order was shouted. The Americans should have swept them aside as easily as a man brushes a fly from his sleeve. But history, as we know, is not written by mathematics. It is written by the resolve of men standing on the precipice of oblivion. If you appreciate these chronicles of impossible odds and the forgotten genius of the British soldier, I invite you to subscribe to our channel and like this video, ensuring that the legacy of these brave few is never lost to the fog of time. To understand the sheer weight of what occurred on that cold November morning, one must look past the mud and see the soul of the army that stood there. These were not the fresh-faced recruits of a peacetime parade. These were the men of the old army, the hard-bitten professionals who had taken the king's shilling and marched to the ends of the earth. They stood in ranks that were distressingly thin, their uniforms stained with the clay of Upper Canada, their boots worn through by weeks of forced marching. They were hungry, they were exhausted, and they were tragically far from home. Yet, as the American drums began to beat a rhythm of impending doom across the field, not a single man in the British line broke rank. Little did the American commanders know as they gazed across the field with predatory anticipation that they were not facing a mere obstacle. They were walking into a masterclass of discipline that would be studied for generations. The American plan was simple, brutal, and seemingly inevitable. This was the Grand Army of the North, a massive invasion force designed to sever the jugular of British North America. They were marching on Montreal. If Morrison's small corps of observation was destroyed here at Chrysler's farm, the road to the capital would be wide open. The supply lines to the west would be cut. Upper Canada, the land we now know as Ontario, would be strangled, starved, and ultimately annexed by the United States. The map of the continent would be redrawn in an afternoon. General James Wilkinson, the American commander, was not a man plagued by doubt. Though he himself was ill, racked by fever and arguably clouded by laudanum, his subordinates were eager for glory. They looked at the British position, a modest line stretching from the river to a pine wood, and saw only a minor nuisance. They did not see the trap. They did not see the ravines that Morrison had so carefully integrated into his defence. Above all, they did not understand the temperament of the man commanding the British forces. Morrison was a man of the 89th Foot, a regiment known as the Sphinxes. He was cool, mathematical, and utterly devoid of panic. Where others saw a massacre, he saw a geometry problem to be solved with gunpowder and steel. He knew that if he retreated, Canada was lost. He knew that if he attacked, his small force would be swallowed up. His only choice was to stand. He had to convince 4,000 men that they were losing, even as they advanced. As the sun struggled to break through the low leaden clouds, the tension on the British line was palpable. A young ensign might have tightened his grip on the regimental colour. A sergeant might have growled a low warning to hold steady. They could see the enemy clearly now. The officers on horseback, the endless rows of muskets, the cannon being wheeled into position to blast them from the earth. The sheer scale of the American force was terrifying. It was a blue horizon, vast and deep. But there is a peculiar alchemy that occurs when British soldiers are backed against a wall. The fear remains, certainly, but it calcifies into a cold, stubborn refusal to yield. As the first American skirmishers stepped onto the frozen mud of the field, triggering the opening shots of the engagement, the men of the 89th did not flinch. They waited for the word of command. They waited for the moment when discipline would collide with brute force. The stage was set for a disaster. The odds were laughable. The outcome seemed certain. But as the smoke began to curl around the pine trees and the roar of the American artillery shattered the morning air, the invaders were about to discover a terrible truth. On this day, on this muddy farm, they were not fighting an army. They were fighting a tradition, and as the first wave of American infantry surged forward with a roar of triumph, believing the day already won, they had no idea that they were stepping into a slaughterhouse of their own making. To truly comprehend the miracle that took place on that frozen field, we must first cast our gaze far beyond the banks of the St. Lawrence River. We must look across the grey Atlantic to a world consumed by fire. The year 1813 was not merely a time of colonial skirmishes, it was the crucible of the modern age. Europe was convulsing in the final desperate throes of the Napoleonic Wars. The little corporal, Napoleon Bonaparte, having survived the catastrophe of Russia, was once again tearing at the seams of the continent, rebuilding his Grande Armée with terrifying speed. For the British War Office in London, the map of the world was a nightmare of red pins and dwindling resources. Every musket, every guinea, and every able-bodied man was being funneled into the ravenous maw of the Peninsular War. The Duke of Wellington was fighting for the very soul of civilization in Spain, and his demands were absolute. Consequently, the defense of British North America, that vast, wild expanse of forests and lakes, was regarded with a chilling, pragmatic detachment. It was a sideshow, a distraction. The orders from London to the commanders in Canada were stark and unforgiving. Hold what you can, but expect nothing. There would be no reinforcements. There would be no great fleet arriving to save the day. The soldiers stationed in the Canadas were, for all intents and purposes, orphaned by the empire that had sent them there. This sense of abandonment hung heavy in the air, sharper than the coming winter frost. The regiments that guarded the border were skeletons, their ranks thinned by sickness and desertion, their uniforms patched and repatched until the original scarlet was barely discernible. They were the forgotten sentinels of the empire, holding a frontier that stretched for 1,000 miles against a neighbor that had grown rich, populous, and belligerent. It was in this climate of scarcity and peril that the United States sensed its moment. The American government, driven by the warhawks in Congress, saw the British distraction in Europe not just as an opportunity, but as a divine invitation. They believed, with a hubris that borders on the theatrical, that the conquest of Canada would be, to quote Thomas Jefferson, a mere matter of marching. They looked north and saw a colony ripe for the plucking, a land defending itself with little more than bravado and rusted iron. In the autumn of 1813, the American Secretary of War, John Armstrong, devised a plan to end the war in a single crushing stroke. It was a strategy of classic military geometry, a massive two-pronged pincer movement designed to sever the head of the British snake. One American army, under General Wade Hampton, would drive north from Lake Champlain. The second, and far larger force, under Major General James Wilkinson, would descend the St. Lawrence River from Sackett's Harbor. Their target was Montreal. We must pause to appreciate the terrifying significance of this objective. In 1813, Montreal was not merely a city. It was the keystone of the entire British position in North America. The St. Lawrence River was the only artery that mattered, the sole lifeline through which supplies, gunpowder, and pay could reach the interior. If Montreal fell, the artery would be severed. Every British soldier, every settler, and every indigenous ally west of that city in Kingston, in York, and on the Niagara frontier would be instantly cut off. They would be starved into submission without a shot being fired. The fall of Montreal meant the death of Upper Canada. It was an existential threat of the highest order. To execute this death blow, General Wilkinson assembled a force that was, by the standards of the frontier, an unstoppable juggernaut. It is difficult for us, In an age of mechanized warfare, to visualize the sheer scale of the armada that gathered at the eastern end of Lake Ontario in October. This was not a raiding party, it was a floating city. Wilkinson had amassed nearly 8,000 soldiers, infantry, artillery, and cavalry. To transport this legion, a flotilla of over 300 vessels had been constructed, heavy gunboats, flat-bottomed bateaux, and Durham boats, all crowded with men and munitions. When this armada launched onto the dark waters of the St. Lawrence, it stretched for miles, a serpent of wood and canvas winding its way down the river. The sight alone was enough to break the spirit of the defenders. To the Canadian militia watching from the shore, concealed in the tree line, it must have looked like the end of the world. The noise of it, the creaking of oars, the shouting of orders, the thousands of distinct splashes would have echoed off the water, announcing the invasion with a terrifying grandeur. Wilkinson, the man at the helm of this leviathan, was a figure of complex and often contradictory reputation, a veteran of the Revolutionary War. He was undoubtedly experienced, yet he was also plagued by a constitution that seemed to fail him at critical moments. He was sick, often confined to his bunk, and heavily medicated with laudanum to manage his ailments. Yet, whatever his personal failings, the mathematical reality of his command remained undeniable. He possessed an overwhelming superiority in numbers. He had the initiative. He had the momentum. Opposing this tidal wave was the British Governor-in-Chief, Sir George Prevost, a man whose caution had become legendary. Prevost looked at his maps in Montreal and despaired. He knew that if Wilkinson and Hampton managed to combine their forces as planned, they would bring nearly 12,000 American troops to the gates of a city defended by perhaps a fraction of that number. The logic of war dictated a retreat. It dictated that the British should pull back, consolidate, and perhaps negotiate a surrender that would salvage some dignity. But war is rarely logical, and the British Army of 1813 was not in the habit of retreating before a fight had even begun. There was a grim determination among the officers of the line, a sentiment that the Americans, for all their numbers, were an undisciplined mob that could be broken if struck with sufficient violence. However, determination alone cannot stop a cannonball, nor can it fill a gap in the line where 10 men should stand, but only one remains. As November arrived, bringing with it the freezing rains and the mud that would define the campaign, the situation became critical. Wilkinson's armada had successfully navigated the upper rapids. They were deep in British territory, moving inexorably closer to their rendezvous with history. The British command had to make a choice. They could not stop the flotilla with a direct confrontation on the water. The Royal Navy simply did not have the ships in position. They could not block the river entirely. Instead, they chose a strategy of supreme risk. They decided to detach a small, nimble force, a corps of observation, to shadow the American armada from the shore. The orders given to this force were dangerously ambiguous. They were to harass the enemy, to pick off stragglers, to delay the advance, and to make the Americans believe that a massive British army was nipping at their heels. It was a bluff of colossal proportions. This task fell to the Left Division, a compilation of units that had been scraped together from the garrisons at Kingston. And at the head of this modest column rode Lieutenant Colonel Joseph Wanton Morrison. As he watched the American sails billowing on the river, moving steadily eastward toward Montreal, Morrison understood the gravity of his position. He was the only obstacle between the invaders and the destruction of the colony. He was the anchor. If he dragged, if he broke, the chain would snap, and the Union Jack would be lowered over Canada forever. Little did Wilkinson know, as he drifted comfortably downriver, dismissing the occasional musket fire from the shore as a mere nuisance, that the man tracking him through the mud was not merely observing. He was hunting, and the ground upon which the hunter would finally spring his trap was drawing closer with every stroke of the oar. In the grand theatre of military history, the spotlight often lingers on the flamboyant, the Morats in their leopard skins, the Wellingtons with their icy wit, or the Napoleons with their brooding genius. But the British Army, the institution that held the line from the blistering sands of the peninsula to the frozen forests of the Canadas, was not built on the shoulders of the flamboyant. It was built on the backs of men like Lieutenant Colonel Joseph Wanton Morrison. If you were to encounter Morrison in the officers' mess, you might not immediately discern the savior of a colony. He was not a man of bluster or unnecessary noise. He was, in every respect, a creature of the old army, a professional soldier who viewed war not as a romantic adventure, but as a serious, methodical trade. There is a profound, almost poetic irony in his presence on that field. In 1813, for Morrison was born in New York. He was a child of the very soil he was now defending against. His father had fought for the crown during the Revolution, and the son had inherited that specific, bitter resolve of the loyalist exile. He knew the American mind, he knew their terrain, and perhaps most dangerously, he knew that this war was a civil conflict in all but name. But a commander is nothing without his instrument, and Morrison wielded a weapon of singular lethality, the 89th Regiment of Foot. They were known, affectionately and respectfully, as the Sphinxes. This curious moniker was not a mere affectation. It was earned in blood on the sands of Egypt against Napoleon's invincibles in 1801. The regiment bore the Sphinx on their cap badges, a symbol of wisdom, silence, and deadly riddles. The men of the 89th who marched through the Canadian mud were not the fresh-faced boys who would die in droves in later wars. These were hard men. They were the leather of the British Army toughened by years of campaigning. Drilled to a mechanical perfection and culturally inured to a hardship, they were hard bargainers, men who complained about the food and the pay, but who would stand in a hail of lead without blinking because their sergeant major told them to. To command such men required a specific temperament. Morrison did not inspire them with speeches of glory. He inspired them with competence. He was a tactician of the old school, a man who understood the geometry of the battlefield better than he understood the politics of promotion. He knew exactly how many paces a line could advance per minute in knee-deep mud. He knew exactly how long it took to reload a Brown Bess musket with frozen fingers. He was a sphinx himself, silent, watchful, and utterly unreadable. Contrasted against this figure of stoic professionalism was the American commander, Major General James Wilkinson. If Morrison was the embodiment of the quiet professional, Wilkinson was the personification of the tarnished aristocrat. History has not been kind to General Wilkinson, and frankly, it has had little reason to be. He was a man who had survived the intrigues of the American Revolution, the Conway Cabal, and the Aaron Burr conspiracy, not through military brilliance, but through a slippery political cunning. One historian famously described him as the general who never won a battle and never lost a court-martial. By the autumn of 1813, Wilkinson was a wreck of a man. He was grotesquely obese, pompous, and notoriously corrupt. But worse than his character was his condition. He was dying by degrees, his body riddled with dysentery and fever. To manage the pain, he consumed laudanum, a tincture of opium, in quantities that would have felled a lesser man. It is a terrifying thought. The command of the largest invasion force in North American history rested in the hands of a man drifting in and out of an opiate haze, alternately paranoid and delusionally overconfident. Wilkinson looked at the map and saw glory. He saw a triumphant entry into Montreal, a legacy secured and perhaps a presidency in his future. He looked at the British forces and saw nothing worthy of concern. He believed the British were terrified, retreating in disarray before his juggernaut. This was his fatal miscalculation. Morrison had been given a task that, on paper, appeared to be a military euphemism for suicide. He was handed command of a course of observation. In the lexicon of the 19th century, this was a force designed to watch, to shadow, and to report. It was not a force designed to fight. His orders were to trail the massive American flotilla as it descended the St. Lawrence, to pick off stragglers, to secure intelligence, and to generally make a nuisance of himself. A lesser officer would have interpreted these orders with an abundance of caution. A lesser officer would have stayed well back, keeping a safe distance from the 4,000 infantry and the artillery train drifting down the river. But Morrison was not a lesser officer. He understood a fundamental truth about the psychology of retreat. If you let an enemy move comfortably, their confidence grows. If you nip at their heels, if you deny them sleep, if you make them bleed for every mile, you sow the seeds of panic. And so, the Sphinx began to hunt. Morrison took his small force, the 89th, the 49th, and his irregulars, and he drove them hard. He did not just observe, he aggressed, working in perfect concert with the Royal Navy gunboats under the dashing Captain Mulcaster Mosquitoes. With stings of iron, Morrison turned the American rearguard into a living hell. By day, Mulcaster's gunboats would emerge from the fog to hammer the American transport ships with 24-pounder shot. By night, Morrison's pickets would harass their camps, firing from the tree lines, capturing sentries and vanishing back into the dark. It was a masterclass in asymmetric warfare before the term existed. Morrison was creating an illusion. He was making his 800 men feel like 3,000. He was noise, he was violence, and he was everywhere. For Wilkinson, floating in his drug-induced stupor, this constant harassment became an unbearable humiliation. It was an itch he could not scratch, a persistent insult to his dignity. His subordinates, men like General Boyd, were furious. They were the Grand Army of the North. Why were they being dictated to by a handful of redcoats and a few gunboats? The morale of the American army began to curdle. They were cold, they were sick, and they were constantly looking over their shoulders. The river, which should have been their highway to victory, had become a gauntlet. Little did they know that this was exactly what Morrison wanted. He was goading them, he was goading the bear, daring it to turn around. It was a gamble of breathtaking audacity. Morrison knew that if Wilkinson decided to turn his entire force around and crush him, the British would be outnumbered 5-1. He knew that if he was caught on open ground, his corps of observation would be annihilated, and the road to Montreal would be left unguarded. But Morrison also read the land. He saw the farm fields narrowing near Crysler's homestead. He saw the ravines, the woods, and the marshy ground. He saw a battlefield that could neutralize numbers. On the night of November 10th, the decision was made. Wilkinson, enraged by the constant stinging of the British mosquitoes, ordered his army to halt. He would not proceed to Montreal with this insult at his back. He would turn, he would deploy, and he would crush this insolent British force once and for all. Morrison, watching from the darkness, must have felt a cold, grim satisfaction. The trap was sprung. The Sphinx had set his riddle. Now the Americans would have to answer it. The observer was about to become the executioner. To understand why a massive army would turn to fight a force a fraction of its size, one must understand the peculiar torture of the St. Lawrence River in November. The water is a dark, churning grey, carrying the first slush of winter. The wind does not merely blow. It cuts through wool and skin, settling into the marrow of the bone. Now, imagine enduring this misery in an open boat, exposed to the elements while drifting down a hostile river in enemy territory. This was the reality for the thousands of American soldiers in Wilkinson's Grand Army. They were cold, they were sick, and they were huddled together like livestock. But the cold was not their only tormentor. Behind them, emerging from the mist like phantoms, came the mosquito fleet. If Lieutenant Colonel Morrison was the hammer on the land, Captain William Mulcaster of the Royal Navy was the anvil on the water. Mulcaster commanded a small squadron of gunboats that trailed the massive American flotilla with the persistence of a bad conscience. These were not the glorious ships of the line that fought at Trafalgar. They were small, ugly, functional vessels sitting low in the water and armed with heavy 24-pounder cannons. They were nimble, they were aggressive, and in the hands of a sailor like Mulcaster, they were devastating. The dynamic on the river became a deadly game of cat and mouse, but with a twisted irony, the mouse was chasing the cat. As the sprawling American armada drifted slowly downriver, struggling with the current and their own disorganization, Mulcaster would strike. He would bring his gunboats within range, unleash a salvo of iron into the rear of the American column, and then slip away before the clumsy American galleys could turn to retaliate. The psychological impact of this cannot be overstated. For the American soldier, cramped in a bateau with no cover, the sound of a distant boom, followed by the screaming whistle of a cannonball, was a source of constant, gnawing terror. They could not fight back. They could only huddle and pray that the next shot did not turn their boat into splinters. It created a sense of helplessness that is poison to an army's morale. They were being hunted. On the shore, Morrison was executing his own parallel torment. As Mulcaster struck from the water, Morrison's light infantry and his indigenous allies moved through the dense forests along the riverbank. They were shadows in the trees. A crack of a rifle, a puff of smoke, and an American officer on the deck of a schooner would slump forward. The Americans were taking fire from the water, and fire from the land. They were caught in a crossfire of harassment that allowed them no rest, no safety, and no dignity. General Wilkinson, drifting in his barge, swaddled in blankets and haze, found this situation intolerable. It is a curious feature of military hubris that a commander can tolerate a defeat in a pitched battle, but he cannot tolerate being annoyed. The sheer insolence of the British tactics was driving him to distraction. Here he was, commanding the mightiest force ever assembled in the north, and he was being pecked to death by what he considered to be a contemptible enemy. Every report brought to his bedside was an embarrassment. "Sir, the rearguard is under fire again." "Sir, Mulcaster has sunk another supply boat." "Sir, the men are afraid to sleep." The Corps of Observation was doing exactly what it was designed to do. It was occupying the mind of the enemy commander. It was forcing him to look backward instead of forward. Morrison and Mulcaster were not just attacking soldiers, they were attacking Wilkinson's ego. The crisis point arrived on the 10th of November. The American army had reached the Longsall Rapids, a dangerous stretch of white water that required careful navigation. To descend the rapids with the British nipping at their heels would be suicide. Mulcaster's gunboats would simply stand off and blast the helpless American vessels as they navigated the turbulent waters. Wilkinson was trapped. He could not go forward without exposing his army to destruction, and he could not ignore the enemy behind him any longer. The Mosquito fleet had done its work. They had stung the Juggernaut until it roared in pain and turned to fight. Wilkinson made the fateful decision. He ordered his army to land. He would disembark the troops, march back up the riverbank, and crush this British nuisance once and for all. He would swat the Mosquito and silence the guns so that he could proceed to Montreal in peace. It was a decision born of frustration, not strategy. He was reacting to Morrison's tune as the American boats turned toward the Canadian shore, grinding onto the mud at a place called Cook's Point. The soldiers spilled out. They were relieved to be off the water, eager to finally get their hands on the enemy that had been tormenting them. They were thousand-strong infantry, cavalry, and artillery. They poured onto the land like a blue flood, confident that sheer weight of numbers would sweep the British into the river. But Morrison was not surprised. He had anticipated this moment. He had been watching the river, reading the movements, and he had already chosen his ground. He did not retreat further. He stopped. He halted his column at the farm of John Crysler, a loyalist settler whose land offered a clear field of fire. The transition from the river chase to the land battle was seamless and terrifying. The harassment phase was over. The Mosquito fleet had delivered the enemy to the doorstep of the 89th Regiment. As the American columns began to form up on the muddy roads, shaking off their sea legs and checking their flints, the atmosphere shifted. The game of hide-and-seek was finished. The time for sharp shooting and cannonades from the water was past. Now it would be a test of standing and dying. Little did the American soldiers know as they marched confidently toward the British position that they were not chasing a fleeing enemy. They were walking into a killing zone prepared by a master tactician. They believed they were the hunters, finally cornering their prey. They did not realize that the prey had stopped running, turned around, and bared its teeth. The Juggernaut had been lured into the mud, and the trap was about to snap shut with a violence that would echo across the Empire. History is often decided by geography, and on the morning of November the 11th, the fate of Canada came down to a few hundred acres of muddy farmland on the north bank of the St. Lawrence. To the untrained eye, John Crysler's farm was unremarkable. A ploughed field, a few snake rail fences, a pine wood, and the grey expanse of the river. But to the cold, calculating gaze of Lieutenant Colonel Morrison, It was a chessboard. It was here, in this mire of freezing mud, that he would attempt to defy the laws of military physics. The terrain itself was the first weapon in Morrison's arsenal. He had chosen this ground with the precision of an engineer. On his right flank lay the St. Lawrence River, a barrier that no army could flank without a navy. On his left lay a dense, tangled, swampy wood, a nightmare of pine roots and bog that would break the cohesion of any column attempting to push through it. Between these two natural walls lay the open field, a killing ground perhaps 700 yards wide. By choosing this spot, Morrison had neutralized the American advantage. Their thousands of men could not spread out to envelope him. They would be forced to funnel themselves into the bottleneck, straight into the teeth of the British line. It is a chilling thing to witness the deployment of a professional army in the moments before destruction. There was no shouting, no chaotic running. There was only the rhythmic thud of boots on wet earth and the sharp, barked commands of the sergeants. Morrison arranged his forces in an echelon formation, a stepped line designed to offer mutual support, forward and to the right. Anchoring the line near the river and the farm buildings stood the flank companies of the 49th Regiment. These were the Green Tigers, the men who had served under the legendary Isaac Brock. They wore the scars of Queenston Heights and the burning of York. Their uniforms were faded, their faces gaunt, but they held their muskets with a familiarity that bordered on intimacy. They were the bait and the bulwark, positioned to take the first shock of the enemy advance. Behind them and to the left, occupying the centre of the field, stood the main body of the 89th Regiment, Morrison's own Sphinxes. Standing in their two-deep line, the classic thin red line of British military law, they looked pitifully few against the horizon, but each man in that line was a trained engine of war, capable of loading and firing 3 rounds a minute in any weather. They stood in the open column of subdivisions, ready to wheel into line and deliver a volley that would shatter bone and spirit alike. To the far left, hidden in the gloom of the swampy woods, lay the wildcards, the Canadian voltigeurs and the Thayendanegea Mohawks. The voltigeurs, French Canadians in their grey uniforms, were light infantry par excellence, masters of the skirmish, capable of moving through the brush like ghosts. Beside them, the Mohawk warriors waited in terrifying silence, their presence alone a psychological weapon that struck fear into the hearts of the American draftees. These men were not fighting for a distant king. They were fighting for their homes, and that desperation gave them a razor's edge. Across the field, the American army began to spill out of the woods and onto the muddy plain. The contrast could not have been more stark. If the British line was a study in geometric order, the American advance was a study in chaotic mass. They poured forward in heavy columns, thousands of men in blue and grey, their officers struggling to maintain formation in the knee-deep mud. This was General Boyd's division, sent by the ailing Wilkinson to sweep the British aside. Boyd was a brave officer, but he was fighting a battle he did not understand. He looked across the field and saw a British force that appeared dangerously exposed. He saw the gaps between the units. He saw the small numbers. He did not see the overlapping fields of fire. He did not see that Morrison had positioned the 49th to draw the Americans in, exposing their flanks to the 89th. Boyd assumed he was facing a desperate rearguard stand. He did not realize he was staring into the barrel of a loaded trap. The atmosphere on the field in those final minutes was heavy with a sensory overload of misery. The rain had turned to a biting sleet. The men were soaked to the skin, their fingers numb on the cold iron of their trigger guards. One can almost smell the damp wool, the stale powder, and the metallic tang of fear. In the British ranks, the silence was absolute. It was a discipline drilled into them on parade grounds in Kent and garrisons in the West Indies. Silence until the order is given. Silence so that the voice of the officer can cut through the chaos of battle. On the American side, there was the murmur of thousands. The tramping of feet, the clattering of artillery caissons struggling in the muck. They brought their cannons forward 6 guns to the British 3 and began to unlimber them. The dark mouths of the artillery pieces swung round to face the Redcoats. The sheer visual disparity was enough to break the nerve of lesser men. To stand in a line of two, watching a column of thousands bear down upon you, requires a suspension of the survival instinct. It requires a belief in the man to your left and the man to your right that transcends logic. Morrison, mounted on his horse, watched the American deployment with a cool detachment. He saw their dragoons, the cavalry, massing on the road. He saw their infantry struggling to form a line in the restricted space he had left them. He saw their artillery exposed. He held his fire. He waited. The British doctrine of the era relied on holding fire until the enemy was terrifyingly close, to maximize the destructive power of the smooth-bore musket. To fire too early was to waste the volley. To fire too early was to waste the volley. To fire too late was to be overrun. It was a game of nerve, played with human lives. The Americans, confident in their numbers, began to beat the drums. The Rogue's March, or perhaps Yankee Doodle, drifted across the wet field, a discordant challenge to the King's men. The massive blue columns began to heave forward, sluggishly at first, then gaining momentum. The mud sucked at their boots, slowing them, tiring them, just as Morrison had predicted. This was the chessboard of mud. The pieces were set. The pawns were moving. On one side, the raw, heaving energy of a young republic, convinced of its manifest destiny. On the other, the rigid, silent geometry of an old empire standing firm on a patch of foreign soil. The tension stretched tight, vibrating in the cold air like a violin string about to snap. Little did the American soldiers in the front ranks know, as they trudged forward with their bayonets fixed, that they were not marching toward a victory. They were marching into a kill box where the geometry of the ground and the discipline of the old army would conspire to dismantle them piece by bloody piece. The silence was about to end, and the argument between the mob and the machine was about to be settled in a roar of flame. The storm broke not with a single thunderous crash, but with a ragged, tearing crackle that erupted from the shadows of the pine woods on the British left. It was the sound of the Canadian voltigeurs and the Mohawk warriors engaging the American flankers, a sharp, stinging prelude to the avalanche that was about to descend. To understand the chaos of a 19th century battlefield, one must strip away the sanitized paintings of orderly lines and fluttering flags. One must imagine a blindness as the first muskets flared in the damp air. A thick, sulphurous smoke began to drift across the field, clinging to the wet earth like a shroud. Within moments, the visual world was reduced to greys and flashes of orange. In this smog, death did not announce itself. It simply arrived. General Boyd, commanding the American forces, committed his first fatal error, an error born of arrogance and the illusion of supremacy. Instead of gathering his massive host into a single unstoppable sledgehammer that would smash the British line through sheer weight, he fed his troops into the battle piecemeal. He sent them in waves, like a gambler throwing good money after bad. The first of these waves crashed against the British right, where the men of the 49th Regiment were anchored near the river and farm buildings. These were the Green Tigers, men who had marched hundreds of miles to stand in this mud. They watched as the American columns emerged from the ravine, a dark blue mass struggling up the slope. The Americans were shouting, huzzahing, trying to intimidate the Redcoats with noise. The 49th answered with a silence that was far more terrifying. "Steady, lads. Wait for it." The sergeants paced behind the line, their spontoons held horizontally to push down any musket that was raised too early. The range closed. 100 yards, 80 yards, 60. The faces of the Americans became visible, eyes wide with adrenaline, mouths open in shouts that were lost in the wind. Then the order came. Fire! The volley from the 49th was not a scattering of shots. It was a single explosive roar. A sheet of flame ripped from the British muzzles. The effect on the American column was instantaneous and horrific. It was as if an invisible giant had swung a scythe through their front ranks. Men crumpled into the mud. The momentum of the charge shattered in a heartbeat. The blue wave hesitated, shuddered, and then recoiled. But this was only the beginning. The American artillery, positioned on the road, roared into life. They began to pound the British line with round-shot solid iron balls that did not explode but skipped across the ground at the speed of sound, taking off legs and smashing torsos with a gruesome kinetic energy. The mud of Chrysler's farm erupted in geysers of black earth and red blood. Morrison, watching from the centre, saw the danger. His own artillery, 3 small 6-pounder guns known affectionately as grasshoppers, were woefully outgunned, but they were manned by the Royal Artillery, technicians of death who knew their trade. They switched to shrapnel shells, a wicked invention of the British Army, hollow spheres filled with musket balls and a timed fuse. These shells burst in the air above the American columns, raining lead down upon them like a steel hail. The air was filled with a cacophony that the human mind struggles to process. The deep chest-thumping bass of the cannons, the sharp rattle of musketry, the screams of horses, and the eerie high-pitched whir of passing shot. On the left flank, in the woods, a different kind of war was raging. The voltigeurs and the Mohawks were fighting a savage hand-to-hand battle among the trees. Here there were no lines, no orders, only the primal struggle for survival. The Americans tried to push through the swampy woods to flank the British line, but they found themselves entangled in a nightmare. Every tree seemed to hide a rifleman. Every shadow seemed to hold a tomahawk. The Americans, terrified of the savages they had been told stories about, began to panic. They fired wildly into the brush, hitting nothing but pine bark, while the unseen enemy picked them off with chilling precision. However, the sheer weight of the American numbers began to tell. General Boyd, realizing his first wave had been repulsed, threw in his second and then his third. He committed the 21st U.S. Infantry, a regiment of regulars who wore grey uniforms like the British skirmishers, causing momentary confusion in the smoke. The pressure on the British right flank became immense. The 49th was being hammered. They were taking casualties at an alarming rate. Gaps appeared in the line, instantly filled by the closing of ranks. Close up, the eternal cry of the British sergeant. The men were stepping over the bodies of their comrades to maintain the wall of red. Their faces were blackened with powder, their lips cracked from biting open cartridges, their shoulders bruised black and blue from the recoil of their muskets. It was an avalanche of humanity. The Americans were pushing forward with a desperation born of embarrassment. They were 4,000 strong. How could they be stopped by this thin ribbon of redcoats? They surged forward again, overlapping the British flank, threatening to envelop the farm buildings. Morrison saw the 49th waver. It was not a lack of courage, it was the physics of war. They were simply being pushed backward by the mass of bodies against them. If the 49th broke, the river flank would collapse. The British army would be pinned against the swamp and slaughtered. The moment hung in the balance. A young British officer, his uniform torn, waved his sword, trying to rally his shrinking company. For the king, stand fast, 49th. But words were losing their power against the roar of the American advance. The blue coats were surging over the rail fences, their bayonets gleaming in the dull light. They were 50 yards away, then 30. The British were firing as fast as they could, but for every American they dropped, 2 more stepped into his place. It seemed, for a terrifying moment, that the American avalanche was unstoppable. The sheer biological mass of the enemy was crushing the tactical finesse of the defence. The British line bent. It groaned under the weight. Little did the triumphant Americans know, as they scented victory and surged toward the faltering 49th, that they were about to be introduced to the other half of Morrison's equation. The 49th was the anvil, battered and ringing under the blows, but the hammer, the cold, silent and fresh 89th Regiment, was waiting in the centre, and it was about to swing with a force that would change the geometry of the battle forever. The avalanche was powerful, yes, but it was about to hit a stone wall that simply refused to move. The history of warfare is often romanticized as a collision of courage, a chaotic swirl of heroism and fury. But at its heart, the Black Powder era was governed by a cold, unforgiving mathematics. It was a calculus of reload times, effective ranges, and the psychological breaking point of the human animal. on the muddy slope of Chrysler's farm as the American avalanche threatened to bury the exhausted 49th Regiment. Lieutenant Colonel Morrison prepared to solve this equation with a brutality that was almost industrial in its precision. The crisis was immediate. General Boyd, sensing the wavering of the British right, played his trump card. From behind the screen of American infantry, a rumble began to build, a sound that vibrates in the chest before it registers in the ear. It was the 2nd U.S. Light Dragoons. Cavalry. Cavalry. In 1813, a cavalry charge was the ultimate psychological weapon. To a foot soldier standing in the mud, a wall of horses thundering toward him at 30 miles an hour, sabres drawn, looked like the wrath of God. The dragoons surged forward, aiming for the gap between the 49th and the river, intending to roll up the British line and turn a retreat into a massacre. They were confident, dashing, and terrifying. They believed the Redcoats, already battered by artillery and infantry fire, would break and run at the mere sight of the hoofs. But they had forgotten the 89th. Morrison, watching the battle unfold with his sphinx-like detachment, gave a quiet order. The 89th Regiment, which had been holding the centre in reserve, did not run. They did not shout, they simply pivoted. With the fluid grace of a machine, the companies wheeled to the right, stepping over the furrowed earth to interpose themselves between the crumbling 49th and the charging American horsemen. They did not form a square, the traditional defence against cavalry, for there was no time. They stood in line, 2 ranks deep. A thin ribbon of scarlet against a tidal wave of blue and brown. It was a moment of supreme professional arrogance. To receive a cavalry charge in line was technically suicidal, unless the discipline of the men was absolute, as the dragoons closed the distance 400 yards. 300, 200, the ground shook. The American troopers leaned over the necks of their horses, screaming for victory. The men of the 89th stood like statues. Their muskets were shouldered. Their officers watched the spacing. There was no fidgeting. No one fired a panic shot. The discipline required to stand motionless while 1,000 pounds of horseflesh gallops toward your chest is perhaps the highest form of courage known to man. 100 yards. The Americans were close enough to see the whites of their eyes. The British muskets came down. Make ready. Present. And then the mathematics of the British volley took over. Unlike the Americans, who often fired in a ragged, all-at-once roar that left them defenseless while they reloaded, the 89th utilized platoon firing. This was a rhythmic, rolling fire by sections. The right of the company fired. Crack. Then the center. Crack. Then the left. Crack. Then the left. Crack. By the time the left had fired, the right was reloaded and ready to fire again. It was a continuous, rolling sheet of flame. A mechanical thresher of lead. The effect on the American cavalry was catastrophic. It was not a battle. It was an execution. The front rank of the dragoons simply evaporated. Horses and men were shredded by the concentrated fire. The momentum of the charge, which relied on the terrified flight of the infantry, slammed into a wall of solid physics. The screaming of horses filled the air as the charge collapsed into a bloody tangle of flailing limbs and mud. The surviving troopers, their nerve broken by the sheer density of the fire, wheeled their mounts and fled in disorder, trampling their own infantry in their haste to escape the killing zone. The cavalry threat was extinguished in seconds, but the American infantry was still advancing. The 21st U.S. Infantry, arguably the best unit in the American Army, marched forward to engage the 89th. They were brave men. They stood their ground. And for a few minutes, the two lines stood face to face in the open field, trading volleys at close range. This is where the battle was truly decided. It became a contest of drill. The Americans fired with enthusiasm, but they fired high. In the stress of combat, untrained men tend to jerk the trigger, sending their bullets whistling harmlessly over the heads of the enemy. The British, however, had been drilled to level their muskets to fire low, aiming at the knees. The 89th settled into a grim rhythm. Load, ram, prime, present, fire. It was a factory of death. The British fire was not just faster, it was lower. It swept the field at waist height. The American line began to shudder. Men dropped in clusters. Their officers, the brave General Covington among them, tried to hold the line, riding back and forth through the smoke, urging their men to stand. But Covington was struck down, mortally wounded by a British marksman. With their general down and the relentless rhythmic hammering of the British volleys tearing them apart, the spirit of the American army began to fracture. They were 4,000 men, but they were being dismantled by 800. They were discovering the hard truth that a mob, no matter how large, is no match for a regiment. The American fire began to slacken. The hussars died in their throats. They looked to the red wall in front of them, obscured by smoke, appearing to grow taller and more invincible with every volley. They looked to the piles of their own dead. They looked for the victory they had been promised, and found only the cold reality of the British regular. Morrison, sensing the shift in the air, that subtle moment when an enemy force transitions from an army to a crowd, knew the time had come. The mathematics had done their work. The equation was balanced in blood. The American confidence had been shattered, their cavalry broken, their best infantry mauled. Little did the American survivors know, as they began to take those first, tentative steps backward, that the worst was not over. The machine that had just broken their assault was not content to merely hold the ground. The Sphinx was about to unsheath its claws. The order was passing down the British line, quiet and deadly, fix bayonets. The defensive phase was over. The counterstroke was about to begin. There is a moment in every great battle that defies the logic of the historian and the calculations of the strategist. It is a moment when the laws of physics, which dictate that the larger mass must displace the smaller, are suddenly and violently suspended by the human spirit. On the field of Crysler's farm, that moment arrived with the metallic rattle of steel against iron. Fix bayonets. The command rippled down the British line, spoken not with the frantic urgency of desperation, but with the cold finality of a judge passing sentence. The men of the 89th Regiment, their faces blackened by powder and their shoulders aching from the recoil of their muskets, reached to their hips. They drew the 17-inch triangular blades, cruel spikes of steel designed not to cut, but to puncture, and locked them onto the muzzles of their weapons. For the American infantry, huddled in the mud and shaken by the devastating volleys they had just endured, the sight of that steel was a psychological hammer blow. They had outnumbered the British 5-1. They had thrown their cavalry at the line and seen it shattered. They had marched their best infantry into the fire and seen it mown down. And now, incredibly, impossible as it seemed, the Redcoats were not just holding their ground, they were coming for them. Morrison raised his sword. The drums beat the advance. And then came the sound that has terrified the enemies of the Crown for centuries. It was not a scream, it was a cheer, a low guttural roar that started in the chests of 800 men and rolled across the field like thunder. It was the sound of an army that knows it has won before the final blow is struck. The British line stepped off. They did not run, they walked. They marched with the same rhythmic cadence they used on the parade ground. Left, right, left, right, left, right, left, right. The 49th Green Tigers, bloodied but unbowed, surged forward on the right. The 89th Sphinxes moved in the center. The skirmishers on the flanks broke from the woods. It was a wall of scarlet and grey, bristling with steel, moving inexorably through the smoke. For the American soldiers, this was the breaking point. The human mind can only endure so much terror. To see a force so small advance with such arrogant confidence against a force so large shattered their reality. The fear of the bayonet is a primal thing. It is a fear of intimacy, of a death that is personal and brutal. The American line, which had been wavering, now dissolved. It started with individuals, men at the rear dropping their muskets and turning toward the river, then small groups, then entire companies. The cohesion of the Grand Army of the North evaporated. The panic spread like a contagion. They are coming, the British are coming. The retreat became a rout. The retreat became a rout. The muddy field, which moments before had been a chessboard of tactical maneuver, became a chaotic stampede. Thousands of American soldiers, blinded by panic, scrambled toward the boats. They abandoned their knapsacks, their muskets, and their wounded. They slid down the muddy banks, fighting each other for a place on the bateaus, desperate to put the freezing waters of the St. Lawrence between themselves and the relentless advance of Morrison's men. The British did not stop. They pressed the advantage, sweeping over the ground where the Americans had stood. They captured the ultimate prize of the battlefield, one of the American cannons. The gunners, abandoned by their infantry, had fled, leaving the bronze piece silent in the mud. As the men of the 89th laid their hands on the cold metal of the enemy gun, a cheer went up that must have been heard in Montreal. It was the tangible proof of their miracle. They had not just survived, they had dominated. As the last American boat pushed off into the Grey River, carrying the broken remnants of Wilkinson's invasion force, a strange silence returned to Crysler's farm. The roar of the cannon was replaced by the moans of the injured, and the wind whistling through the pines. The battle was over. The physics of war had been rewritten. 800 men had defeated 4,000. Morrison sat on his horse, looking out at the river. He did not smile. He knew the cost. The field was strewn with the bodies of his own men and the enemy alike. But he also knew what he had achieved. He had looked the giant in the eye and made him blink. The invasion was broken. Montreal was safe. And on this muddy patch of Canadian soil, the old army had proved once and for all that victory is not measured in battalions, but in the heart of the soldier who refuses to yield. Little did the retreating Americans know, as they rode sullenly away into the gathering gloom, that this defeat was not just a tactical setback. It was the death knell of their entire northern strategy. They would never come this close to Montreal again. The door to the north had been slammed shut, locked by a bayonet, and held by a forgotten genius who understood that in the end, the only odds that matter are the ones you refuse to accept. The aftermath of a battle is often more telling than the fighting itself. At Crysler's farm, the silence that descended was not merely the absence of noise, it was the heavy, suffocating weight of a dream dying. As the sun set on November 11th, 1813, it did not just mark the end of a day, it marked the end of the United States' greatest ambition in the North. The Grand Army of the North, which had launched with such fanfare, such pomp, and such terrifying numbers, was now a broken thing. The retreat to their boats was a spectacle of misery. Men who had marched onto the field with the swagger of conquerors were now dragging themselves through the mud, clutching wounds, casting fearful glances back at the tree line where the Redcoats stood. They had been mauled. Their confidence had been shattered by a force they could barely comprehend, a force that, by all rights, they should have crushed under their boots. General James Wilkinson, lying in his barge, listened to the reports with a growing sense of dread. The truth of the battle was too painful, too humiliating to accept. And so, as defeated commanders often do, he began to construct a lie to salvage his dignity. He told himself, and he would later tell his superiors in Washington, that he had faced a massive British army. He inflated the numbers of Morrison's force, turning 800 men into thousands. He spoke of insurmountable odds. It was a delusion born of opium and shame. But it served a vital purpose. It gave him permission to quit. The flotilla pushed off from the Canadian shore, drifting sullenly downriver. The wind had picked up, howling across the water, driving the sleet into the faces of the demoralized troops. They crossed to the American side, seeking refuge, seeking safety, seeking anything but the old army that was watching them from the north bank. But the final blow was yet to land. As the battered army huddled on the shore near Cornwall, a message arrived for Wilkinson. It was a dispatch from General Wade Hampton, the commander of the other prong of the invasion, the army that was supposed to be marching north from Lake Champlain to meet Wilkinson at Montreal. The plan, the grand strategy, relied entirely on these two armies meeting. The letter was a death sentence for the campaign. Hampton, who had suffered his own humiliation at the hands of the French-Canadian voltigeurs at the Battle of the Chateauguay just weeks earlier, was not coming. He was retreating. He had turned back. Wilkinson read the words and felt the loss to the snap. He was alone. His army was beaten, sick and demoralized. His partner had abandoned him. The pincer movement, which was supposed to strangle Montreal, had been snapped at both ends. The impossible odds had not just been overcome by the British, they had been reversed. The hunters had become the hunted. The decision was made in a council of war that was more of a wake. The invasion was over. There would be no march on Montreal. There would be no winter in the captured capital. Instead, the army would go into winter quarters at a desolate place called French Mills. The retreat to French Mills became a tragedy of its own. The American army, ill-equipped for a Canadian winter, began to rot. Sickness, which had already plagued them, now ran rampant. Typhus and pneumonia did what the British muskets had started. Men died by the hundreds in their freezing tents. They deserted in droves, walking away into the snow, choosing the risk of a court-martial over the certainty of a frozen death. The Grand Army simply dissolved. On the other side of the river, the mood could not have been more different. The news of the American retreat spread through the Canadas like wildfire. In Montreal, the church bells rang. In York and Kingston, bonfires were lit. The relief was palpable. The juggernaut had been stopped. The wolf had been at the door, scratching at the wood, and a handful of men, Morrison, Mulcaster, the 49th, the 89th, and the indigenous warriors, had driven it away. This was the domino effect in its purest form. Because Morrison stood at Crysler's farm. Wilkinson halted. Because Wilkinson halted, the junction with Hampton failed. Because the junction failed, Montreal was saved. Because Montreal was saved, the supply lines to the west remained open. And because the supply lines remained open, the British were able to fight on for another year, eventually forcing a stalemate that preserved the border as we know it today. It is a sobering thought to consider how close it was. If Morrison had been a lesser man, if the 89th had broken, if the Americans had simply pushed harder, the map of North America would look very different today. We might be speaking of the province of Ontario as a quaint historical footnote, a territory annexed in 1813, but history does not deal in what-ifs. It deals in the brutal reality of what happened. And what happened was that a massive modern army was turned back by the discipline of a few and the arrogance of its own leaders. The American invasion force, which had outnumbered the entire population of the region it was invading, limped home in disgrace, leaving behind their dead and their dreams in the frozen mud of the St. Lawrence. As the winter snow began to blanket the battlefield at Crysler's farm, covering the scars of the artillery and the shallow graves of the fallen, a silence returned to the valley. It was the silence of a frontier that had been tested and found unbreakable. The crisis was over. The impossible had been achieved. But as the soldiers of the 89th cleaned their muskets and warmed their hands by the fire, they knew that their work was not done. They were professionals, after all. They had done their duty. They had saved a country that was not quite their own, for a king who would likely never know their names. And as the years passed and the grass grew over the field, the world began to forget. Little did they know that their victory would fade into the mist, overshadowed by the louder battles of history. Waterloo, Gettysburg, the Somme. They did not know that they would become the forgotten army. But for one brief, shining moment in November 1813, they were the most important soldiers in the world. And it is to their legacy and the enduring lesson of their sacrifice that we must turn our final attention. History is a fickle guardian of the truth. It has a tendency to remember the flamboyant, the tragic, and the loud, while the quiet, competent professionals who actually hold the world together are often allowed to drift into the shadows. We know the names of Wellington and Nelson. Their statues dominate our squares, and their victories are the bedrock of our national myth. But ask a man on the streets of London or Toronto today who Joseph Wanton Morrison was, and you will likely be met with silence. This is a profound injustice, for for the victory at Crysler's farm was not merely a skirmish in the backwoods of the Empire. It was one of the most clinically perfect defensive battles ever fought by the British Army. Morrison was eventually awarded the Gold Medal for his conduct, a rare and prestigious honour restricted to field officers of the highest distinction. Yet, he did not return home to parades or accolades. He remained a soldier, a servant of the crown, doing his duty until he died, as he had lived in service to the king, succumbing to fever at sea years later. Perhaps his obscurity is the price of his perfection. There was no desperate last stand, no tragic martyrdom like that of Isaac Brock at Queenston Heights. Morrison did not die dramatically. He simply won efficiently. He made the impossible look routine. He took a terrifying existential threat, an invasion force that outnumbered him 5-1, and dismantled it with the cool precision of a master craftsman dismantling a clock. But if the man has been forgotten, the lesson of his victory must never be lost. Crysler's farm stands as the ultimate vindication of the old army. It was the triumph of quality over quantity, of discipline over enthusiasm. The American army that marched onto that field believed in the weight of numbers. They believed that a republic of free men, simply by virtue of their mass and their vigour, could sweep aside the rigid hierarchies of the old world. Morrison and the men of the 89th Regiment proved them wrong. They demonstrated, with a lethality that still chills the blood, that war is not a democratic process. It is a contest of will, and the will of a regiment bound together by drill, tradition, and mutual trust is harder than iron. They proved that 800 men, acting as one body, are infinitely stronger than 4,000 men, acting as 4,000 individuals. Today, if you travel to the banks of the St. Lawrence River, the battlefield is quiet. The mud that once sucked at the boots of the 49th and the American Dragoons has long since been covered by grass and crops. Much of the original ground was submerged when the seaway was built, a final watery shroud for the men who fell there. But a monument remains. It stands tall against the Canadian sky, a granite sentinel watching over the river that Morrison defended. It is a lonely place, far from the bustle of the cities that were saved by the blood shed on that soil. Yet there is a profound dignity in that isolation. It is a fitting memorial for the forgotten army. The men who lie beneath that ground, the Redcoats of the 89th, the Green Tigers of the 49th, the Voltigeurs and the warriors of the Six Nations, did not fight for fame. They fought because they had taken an oath. They fought because the man next to them stood firm. They fought because, in the end, they were the thin red line, and it is the nature of the line that it does not break. We live in an age that often scorns discipline and valorizes the individual above the collective. We would do well to look back at that cold November day in 1813 and remember what was achieved by men who understood the value of standing together. They held the gate when the world was burning. They secured a future for a nation that was still in its infancy. They taught us that courage, when tempered by discipline, is the only number that truly counts. So, let us leave them there in the quiet mists of the St. Lawrence. Let us salute the Sphinx and his riddle, the general who conquered without a shout, and the soldiers who defeated the impossible. They may be forgotten by the masses, but as long as we tell their story, they will never truly die.